admit that it feels a little strange to jump immediately from Sense and Sensibility, which is so notably unpopular among modern readers of Jane Austen, to Pride and Prejudice, which has always stood out as the favorite child of Jane Austen's books. It's certainly not difficult to read Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice as almost intentionally constructed opposites. We have Sense and Sensibility, where the narrative is controlled by the destructive power of money, and where the narrator's view of marriage is so consistently cynical as to destroy any possibility of creating a romantic atmosphere. And then we have Pride and Prejudice, which Jane Austen herself called, quote, rather too light and bright and sparkling. Jane Austen has a tendency to not take things seriously. Lucy Worsley is always cautioning us to consider that Jane is joking in any given situation, but her description of Pride and Prejudice as light and bright and sparkling remains one of the best ways to describe her most iconic book, because it is light and bright and sparkling. But how did we go from Sense and Sensibility to Pride and Prejudice? How did we get from the darkness of Sense and Sensibility to the light of Pride and Prejudice? In Sense and Sensibility, we follow sisters Elinor and Marianne Dashwood. Elinor, who relies too much on logic, and Marianne, who relies too much on emotion, as they try to navigate the ups and downs of life, love, and unreliable men. In Pride and Prejudice, we follow sisters Jane and Elizabeth Bennet as they deal with embarrassing family members, annoying neighbors, and unreliable men. But while in Sense and Sensibility, our primary point of view character is the sensible sister, Elinor, in Pride and Prejudice, we are following Elizabeth, who is far more similar to Marianne Dashwood. If I were to pick 3 adjectives to describe Marianne, I would say that she is emotional, obviously, as she is Miss Sensibility, judgmental, and socially rebellious. And I do feel the need to point out that all 3 adjectives are also applicable to Elizabeth Bennet. Pride and Prejudice was originally titled First Impressions, but mistaken first impressions are also a major theme of Sense and Sensibility, especially when it comes to how Marianne sees and judges people. Her first reaction to the man who will eventually become her husband, Colonel Brandon, is that he's old and gross and incapable of love. Now, to be fair, he is only 5 years younger than her mother, and I am not a fan of these 2 characters ending up together, but I do have to sympathize when her mother says to her sarcastically, "It must seem to you a miracle that my life has been extended to the advanced age of 40. And as everyone knows, Elizabeth Bennet has an even worse reaction when she meets her future husband, the handsome, rich, but socially inept Fitzwilliam Darcy. Early on in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth and her 4 sisters, Jane, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, attend a ball where the two most interesting single men are Mr. Bingley, who is rich, and his best friend, Mr. Darcy, who is super, ultra, mega rich. Bingley notices that Darcy has not asked anyone to dance, and he suggests that he ask, oh, you know, that pretty girl sitting over there. Darcy looks over and says, oh, she's, quote, tolerable, but not attractive enough for him to dance with. Ouch! Yikes! But what makes this little comment worse is that Bingley and Darcy are talking about Elizabeth, and Elizabeth overhears them. The narrative says, Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings towards him, and honestly, I don't think anyone can blame her. Another similarity between Elizabeth and Marianne is that once they've made up their minds about someone or something, they're not very willing to change their opinions because they both have a lot of confidence in their own judgment. Perhaps too much confidence. There's a really interesting paper called Is Sense and Sensibility Jane Austen's most religious novel? This paper is by Roger E. Moore, and it was published in volume 44 of the Jane Austen-focused literary journal Persuasions. In this paper, Moore conducts an in-depth analysis of Marianne Dashwood's character while he compares her to the religious enthusiasts of the 17th and 18th centuries. Putting aside the question of religion in Sense and Sensibility, I do think Moore has some interesting insights into who Marianne is and how she operates. And Moore definitely has a lot to say about Marianne's self-confidence. Marianne comes closest to true enthusiasm when she responds to Elinor's criticism of her visit with Willoughby to Allenham. If there had been any real impropriety in what I did, I should have been sensible of it at the time, for we always know when we are acting wrong, and with such a conviction, I could have had no pleasure. While she does not claim a divine sanction for her belief, she does demonstrate an enthusiast's confidence in her own goodness and infallibility. By her logic, she could never be in error because she would always know in advance if an impulse was wrong or not. Elizabeth has a similar degree of self-confidence, not so much about her own goodness and infallibility, but about her ability to read people. Let's consider, for example, how Elizabeth views best friends Darcy and Bingley. One of the most interesting through lines in Pride and Prejudice is the constant comparison between Darcy and Bingley, who are presented as polar opposites from the very first scene in which they appear together, which is the infamous ball scene where Darcy rejects Elizabeth. In this scene, Bingley is described as, quote, good-looking and gentlemanlike, with, quote, a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. Darcy is also described as having, quote, handsome features, but notably, he has, quote, a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance. The Bingley-Darcy dynamic is very much a case of opposites attract, which is how the narrative describes their friendship. Between him and Darcy, there was a very steady friendship, in spite of a great opposition of character. Bingley was endeared to Darcy by the easiness, openness, and ductility of his temper, though no disposition could offer a greater contrast to his own, and though with his own he never appeared dissatisfied. On the strength of Darcy's regard, Bingley had the firmest reliance, and of his judgment the highest opinion. In understanding, Darcy was the superior. Bingley was by no means deficient, but Darcy was clever. He was, at the same time, haughty, reserved, and fastidious, and his manners, though well-bred, were not inviting. In that respect, his friend had greatly the advantage. Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared. Darcy was continually giving offense. Now, we already know that Elizabeth doesn't like Darcy, but she also finds him hard to read. She is constantly wondering why he's paying so much attention to her and why he keeps staring at her, because obviously he couldn't be falling for her. That wouldn't make any sense. But when it comes to Bingley, Elizabeth is 100% sure that she's got him figured out. For example, we could take a look at this scene, which takes place at Netherfield, the home that Bingley is renting, and Bingley is the first speaker in this conversation. "Whatever I do is done in a hurry," replied he, "and therefore, if I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself as quite fixed here." "That is exactly what I should have supposed of you," said Elizabeth. "You begin to comprehend me, do you?" cried he, turning towards her. "Oh, yes, I understand you perfectly. I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I am afraid, is pitiful. That is, as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours." "Lizzie!" cried her mother, "remember where you are, and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to do at home." "I did not know before," continued Bingley immediately, "that you are a studier of character. It must be an amusing study." "Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage." On the surface, Elizabeth would seem safe in assuming that cheerful, open-hearted, friendly Charles Bingley doesn't have a particularly deep or intricate character. But just as she's taken by surprise when Darcy eventually pulls a surprise proposal to her, Elizabeth is similarly confused by Bingley's actions. Elizabeth's sister Jane has fallen in love with Bingley. Bingley seems equally attracted to the beautiful Jane, and it seems like an engagement must be right around the corner. But then, suddenly, unexpectedly, Bingley leaves with no intention of returning. We all know that Jane Austen is a big fan of irony, and one of the biggest ironies in Pride and Prejudice is that Bingley, cheerful, open-hearted, friendly, is actually the hardest character to read. And where does this reversal of events leave Elizabeth? Well, as Juliet McMaster writes in her 1981 book, The Novel from Sterne to James, it is part of the pattern of the novel that Elizabeth, the studier of character, the clever girl who prides herself on her discernment, should constantly and surprisingly emerge as less astute than the relative dullards who surround her. In Sense and Sensibility, Marianne's confidence in her own judgment leads her to trust Willoughby, a handsome and charming young man who, promptly abandons her for an heiress with £50,000. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth's confidence in her own judgment leads her to trust Wickham, a handsome and charming young man who, quote-unquote, exposes Darcy, but is later revealed to have been the real villain all along. It's also worth noting that both Marianne and Elizabeth are not overly concerned with social conventions. Moore, for example, calls Marianne, quote, a revolutionary character because, as he says, Marianne's sensibility is a system, like those of the revolutionaries, that has the potential to disrupt and undermine society. As an example of how Marianne's sensibility translates to revolutionary ideas, he again points to Marianne's potentially inappropriate visit to Allenham with Willoughby. She, Marianne, shares the French revolutionaries' lack of respect for the integrity of the property of others. They thought nothing of confiscating ecclesiastical lands or assigning the houses of royalty and nobles to more deserving owners. Like a true revolutionary, Marianne relishes the thought of supplanting Mrs. Smith, the rightful owner. She enjoys contemplating the stripping of the forlorn old furniture from the house, anything that connects it with the past, and the remaking of it in her own image. Austen follows Burke here. Oh, side note about Burke. So Burke is a reference to Edmund Burke, who was this very anti-revolutionary conservative thinker who was very influential in Jane Austen's time. As he, Burke, continually frames the French Revolution as an assault on venerable houses, so too Austen imagines Marianne's sensibility as a revolutionary threat to property and ownership. But while we're supposed to see Marianne's socially unconventional behavior as something that needs to be changed or fixed, I mean, no one ever accuses Jane Austen of being pro-revolution, okay? Elizabeth's socially unconventional behavior, on the other hand, plays into a more complicated narrative dialogue about Georgian/Regency England's excessively restrictive society. One of Elizabeth Bennet's defining characteristics is that she is independent and self-willed. She will walk 3 miles through the mud to visit her sick sister, and she'll turn down Darcy, aka Mr. £10,000 a year, because she doesn't love him. In her essay for the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen, Rachel Bronstein writes that, quote, readers have argued that Elizabeth is either a proto-feminist or a fairy tale heroine. But whatever you think of Elizabeth and her ultimate decision to accept Mr. £10,000 a year, I do think that having this particular self-willed protagonist in this particular restrictive setting does serve to highlight what is arguably the biggest question of Pride and Prejudice, the question of female agency. Part 2. Choices, and more choices. How much power should women have over their own lives? And does it matter whether they'll use that power to make good decisions or bad decisions? Should they only be allowed to have power if they can be trusted to make good decisions, or should they be trusted to make their own decisions regardless and be trusted to deal with the consequences? This is a question that comes up often in the work of Jane Austen. In Sense and Sensibility, the answer seems to be that only Elinor Dashwood, with her more or less sound judgment, can be truly trusted to make her own decisions. Marianne Dashwood, with her faultier judgment, is ultimately not trusted to make what is considered the most important decision in a Regency/Georgian woman's life: who to marry. At the end of the book, Elinor, Edward, and Mrs. Dashwood all conspire to marry Marianne off to Colonel Brandon, who, remember, is only 5 years younger than her own mother. Elinor's marriage divided her as little from her family as could well be contrived, without rendering the cottage at Barton entirely useless, for her mother and sisters spent much more than half their time with her. Mrs. Dashwood was acting on motives of policy as well as pleasure in the frequency of her visits at Delaford, for her wish of bringing Marianne and Colonel Brandon together was hardly less earnest, though rather more liberal than what John had expressed. It was now her darling object. To see Marianne settled at the mansion house was equally the wish of Edward and Elinor. They each felt his sorrows and their own obligations, and Marianne, by general consent, was to be the reward of all. With such a confederacy against her, with a knowledge so intimate of his goodness, with a conviction of his fond attachment to herself, which at last, though long after it was observable to everybody else, burst on her, what could she do? What could she do, indeed? Honestly, I feel so bad for Marianne. But in Pride and Prejudice, this question of female autonomy is far more complicated and complex, as we can see when we consider the very different characters of Charlotte Lucas, Lydia Bennet, and Elizabeth herself. Let's begin with Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte Lucas is dangerously close to the end of her 20s. She has no real marriage prospects, and so when Mr. Collins, a stuffy, pompous, social climbing clergyman, proposes to Elizabeth and is refused, Charlotte decides to marry him instead. This decision shocks and confuses Elizabeth, as we can see in this scene. The possibility of Mr. Collins's fancying himself in love with her friend had once occurred to Elizabeth within the last day or two, but that Charlotte could encourage him seemed almost as far from possibility as that she could encourage him herself, and her astonishment was consequently so great as to overcome at first the bounds of decorum, and she could not help crying out, "Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible!" The steady countenance which Miss Lucas had commanded in telling her story gave way to a momentary confusion here on receiving so direct a reproach, though, as it was no more than she expected, she soon regained her composure and calmly replied, "Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion because he was not so happy as to succeed with you?" But Elizabeth had now recollected herself, and making a strong effort for it, was able to assure her, with tolerable firmness, that the prospect of their relationship was highly grateful to her, and that she wished her all imaginable happiness. "I see what you are feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very much surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you. But But when you have had time to think it all over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state. Elizabeth quietly answered, undoubtedly, and after an awkward pause, they returned to the rest of the family. Charlotte did not stay much longer, and Elizabeth was then left to reflect on what she had heard. It was a long time before she became at all reconciled to the idea of so unsuitable a match. The strangeness of Mr. Collins's making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison of his being now accepted. She had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she could not have supposed it possible that, when called into action, she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture, and to the pang of a friend disgracing herself and sunk in her esteem was added the distressing conviction that it was impossible for that friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen. I want to highlight the conclusion of this excerpt, that it was impossible for that friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen, because this points to the conflicting viewpoints behind Elizabeth and Charlotte's argument over Mr. Collins. There's a paper called Charlotte and Elizabeth, Multiple Modernities in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. This paper is by Melina Moe, and it was first published in the journal English Literary History in winter 2016. In this paper, Moe argues that, quote, Charlotte regards marriage as an external goal, a condition she was bound to inhabit if it was in her power to do so. Whereas, Moe argues, Elizabeth considers marriage as only a single step on her journey of self-discovery. So when Elizabeth claims that it is impossible for Charlotte to find future happiness on this path that she's chosen, she is employing the self-centered logic that because it would be impossible for her to marry Mr. Collins and be happy, it is therefore impossible for her best friend to marry Mr. Collins and be happy. But, as Moe says, Charlotte Lucas marries Mr. Collins and expects to live a fulfilling life with him. Conscious of Elizabeth's differing views, Charlotte anticipates being hurt by her friend's disapprobation, but makes no excuses for her marriage as an act of martyrdom or of submission to crushing necessity. Elizabeth sees marriage as an extension of self, whereas Charlotte sees it as her only realistic option in a society where women like her have no other way to secure a home and an income. Therefore, Elizabeth rejects Mr. Collins and Charlotte accepts him. Both women are exercising what Moe calls their differing, quote, styles of judgment to choose the future that appeals most to them. Charlotte chooses the safety of a mediocre but secure future, whereas Elizabeth holds out for the uncertain possibility of an unequivocally happy future. But while Elizabeth certainly judges Charlotte for her choice, Jane Austen herself does not. Lucy Worsley says in Jane Austen at Home that, quote, she paints a compassionate picture of Charlotte Lucas, who marries a house rather than a man, And this compassion comes from Jane Austen's recognition that regardless of what Elizabeth Bennet would or would not choose for her own future, Charlotte is free to find what happiness she can in her marriage to Mr. Collins. Speaking of choices, the character who makes by far the worst choices in Pride and Prejudice is Jane and Elizabeth's youngest sister, the 15-year-old Lydia Bennet. Like Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice is full of twists and turns. And like in Sense and Sensibility, these twists and turns largely come out of people behaving in unpredictable ways. Charles Bingley seems to be deeply in love with Jane Bennet, but then he leaves for London, seemingly never to return. Fitzwilliam Darcy seems to dislike Elizabeth, then pulls a surprise proposal and reveals that he's fallen in love with her. Elizabeth angrily refuses his proposal, then starts to think that maybe he's not such a bad guy, especially after she sees his magnificent estate Pemberley. Then she falls in love with him. Eventually, of course, everything resolves happily ever after. Bingley proposes to Jane, Darcy re-proposes to Elizabeth, and just as in Sense and Sensibility, part of the happy ending involves the sisters living just down the road from each other. Quote, Jane and Elizabeth, in addition to every other source of happiness, were within 30 miles of each other. But possibly the biggest plot twist in Pride and Prejudice involves Lydia Bennet, who in Part 3, or Volume 3, if you want to be technical, runs off with Wickham, the untrustworthy scoundrel who attempted to destroy Darcy's reputation. At first, the Bennets are hopeful that Lydia and Wickham ran off to be married, but then it's revealed that they are living together in London with zero plans to get married. Given the Georgian/Regency setting, this is a big no-no, and in fact is probably the biggest act of moral transgression in the entire book. As Mary Bennet, the most bookish and studious of the Bennet girls, says to Elizabeth, "This is a most unfortunate affair, and will probably be much talked of, but we must stem the tide of malice and pour into the wounded bosoms of each other the balm of sisterly consolation." Yes, Mary Bennet always talks like this. Then, perceiving in Elizabeth no inclination of replying, she added, "Unhappy as the event must be for Lydia, we may draw from it this useful lesson, that loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable, that one false step involves her in endless ruin, that her reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful, and that she cannot be too much guarded in her behavior towards the undeserving of the other sex." Clearly, giving Lydia Bennet the power to make her own decisions has had disastrous consequences. In a conventional narrative of this time period, this is where the author would draw the line, where she would drive home the point that women should be allowed to have agency, but only up to a certain point. Arguably, this is what the Jane Austen who wrote Sense and Sensibility would have done. For example, there is the story of Eliza Brandon, a character in Sense and Sensibility who was married against her will, had an affair that produced an illegitimate daughter, was divorced by her cruel husband, and eventually landed in debtor's prison and died shortly afterward. The narrative of Sense and Sensibility is sympathetic to Eliza's struggles, but it still kills her off as a moral punishment for her sins. Eliza Brandon cannot be allowed to live and flourish. But Pride and Prejudice is not Sense and Sensibility, and Mary Bennet is not a character we're meant to take seriously. Throughout the novel, the narrative consistently makes fun of Mary's, quote, threadbare morality, and also her habit of quoting books she doesn't really understand. And when it comes to judging Lydia Bennet's actions, Mary is far more harsh than the narrative. Instead of killing Lydia off, the narrative allows her to have what is close enough to a happy ever after. Wickham is coerced into marrying Lydia, her parents forgive Lydia and welcome her home, and thanks to the generosity of Elizabeth and Jane, who are now rich, Wickham and Lydia never run out of money. It's true that we're not meant to like Lydia or find her admirable, but we're also not meant to see her as a character who deserves to suffer or be punished in some horrific way. We can see this in Mr. Bennet's reaction to Mr. Collins's letter, where Mr. Collins scolds him for, I don't know, not disowning Lydia and casting her out onto the streets. Here's the relevant excerpt. Mr. Collins, moreover, adds, I am truly rejoiced that my cousin Lydia's sad business has been so well hushed up, and am only concerned that their living together before the marriage took place should be so generally known. I must not, however, neglect the duties of my station or refrain from declaring my amazement at hearing that you received the young couple into your house as soon as they were married. It was an encouragement of vice, and had I been the rector of Longbourn, I should very strenuously have opposed it. You ought, certainly, to forgive them as a Christian, but never to omit them in your sight, or allow their names to be mentioned in your hearing. That is his notion of Christian forgiveness. Just as Mary's moralistic judgment of Lydia goes ignored by Elizabeth, Mr. Bennet is scornful of Mr. Collins's suggestion that Lydia deserves to be punished. Lydia makes bad decisions, yes, but she is still given the freedom to make them. And finally, when it comes to women making their own choices in Pride and Prejudice, we need to talk about Miss Elizabeth Bennet herself. Pride and Prejudice has some of the most famous opening lines in literature, and these famous opening lines reaffirm one of my core theses when it comes to Jane Austen, which is that every Jane Austen book, to a greater or lesser extent, is about money. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. So in the first sentence of the book, we have a single man in possession of a good fortune, and in the second sentence, we are told that this hypothetical man is considered as the rightful property of the single women in the neighborhood. There's a paper called The Materialistic Marriage Market: Intersections of Money and Matrimony in Pride and Prejudice, which was first published in volume 42 of the journal Persuasions. And in this paper, the author J.R. Herman says, "The commodification of potential marriage partners acts as an ever-present theme from the very beginning of the novel. Women and family members of women looking for husbands view men not as human beings, but instead as property, nothing more than objects claimed on a first-come, first-served basis." But, as Herman notes, this commodification of potential marriage partners goes both ways. If men like Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy are considered hot properties on the marriage market because of their wealth and status, then women are also judged based on what material advantages that they can bring to a marriage. Unfortunately for Elizabeth Bennet, as fun and smart and lively as she is, there really isn't much that she can bring, money-wise or property-wise to a marriage. As Herman says, Elizabeth's lowly connections and lack of fortune make her an unattractive potential spouse on the financially driven marriage market because she simply has no money to bring into a marriage and will rely wholly on her husband's income once married. So, when it comes to the question of marriage, who's she going to marry? Elizabeth is expected to make good decisions, rational decisions, decisions that will ensure that she doesn't end up homeless and penniless after her father's inevitable death. But how does Elizabeth actually act over the course of Pride and Prejudice? From a financial standpoint, she acts completely irrationally. First, she rejects Mr. Collins's marriage offer, which Herman categorizes as, quote, a financially reckless, rash decision. Then, in a highly emotional, combative scene, she turns down Mr. Darcy with his £10,000 a year and large estate. And Herman says, quote, from a financial standpoint, if rejecting Mr. Collins was rash and foolish, rejecting Mr. Darcy must be classified as insane. As it turns out, Elizabeth's almost violent rejection of Mr. Darcy, on top of being a bad financial decision, was based on a completely mistaken evaluation of his character and is also, therefore, morally suspect. Her mistake is a mistake, not only because she lost out on £10,000 a year, not only because she yelled at a man who didn't really deserve to be yelled at, but more fundamentally, it proves that there is something wrong with how she makes decisions. As Juliet McMaster says in the novel From Stern to James, when she, Elizabeth, discovers the extent to which she has been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd, she connects the discovery with the self-image she has created. I, who have prided myself on my discernment, I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister and gratified my vanity in useless or blameless distrust. We judge her, and she judges herself, not only for her prepossession and ignorance, but because, as she says, she has courted prepossession and ignorance, as she has encouraged prejudices and has been determined to hate Darcy. Time and again, Elizabeth Bennet insists on being given the agency to make her own decisions, and then uses that agency to make decisions that range from irrational to questionable to downright mistaken. And yet, far from being punished, by the end of the story, Elizabeth Bennet is rewarded with a level of happiness that meets even her own extremely high standards. And in part, she achieves that happiness precisely because she refuses to conform to what her money-driven, status-conscious society demands of her. Why does Darcy, Mr. 10,000 pounds a year himself, fall in love with Elizabeth? And why does Elizabeth fall in love with him? It's because they're finally able to see each other for who they are. Two flawed people who aren't perfect, but who are perfect for each other. As Herman argues, Elizabeth not only rejects marrying for money, but also rejects the commodification of Mr. Darcy, something that allows their relationship to develop into a meeting of the minds rather than just a product of a financially driven marriage market. While many women would commodify Mr. Darcy and view him solely as a prize to claim, an object to possess, or a 10,000 pounds a year stepping stone to wealth and high society, to Elizabeth, whether she hated him or loved him, Mr. Darcy always remained human. So, where does all of this leave the question of female agency? Whether we're discussing a pragmatic character like Charlotte, a silly character like Lydia, or an imperfect but lovable character like Elizabeth, it's clear that Pride and Prejudice is a deeply sympathetic portrayal of all the nuances, all the difficulties, and all the small joys that define Georgian/Regency era womanhood. Elizabeth Bennet is, like Marianne Dashwood, impulsive, socially rebellious, and overly self-confident. Pride and Prejudice, like Sense and Sensibility, deals with mistaken first impressions, hasty judgments, and trying and failing to understand the actions of other people. But ultimately, Elizabeth is not Marianne, and Pride and Prejudice is not Sense and Sensibility. The transition from Jane Austen's debut novel to her most beloved work is a startling one. From the darkness of Sense and Sensibility, a world controlled entirely by selfishness and the terrifying power of money, we emerge into the light and bright and sparkling world of Pride and Prejudice, where laughter is everywhere, humanity shines through, and love is triumphant.